Secretary of State Rex W. Tillerson spoke during a meeting with the Prime Minister of Libya, Fayez al-Sarraj, on Friday. Alex Getty Images Washington. President Trump on Friday rejected reports that he would soon fire Secretary of State Rex W. Tillerson as fake news, but declared that I call the final shots as he acknowledged his disagreements with his top diplomat. The president's tweet was posted a few hours after Mr. Tillerson described reports this week that the White House wanted him to resign as laughable. He's not leaving, and while we disagree on certain subjects, I call the final shots. We work well together and America is highly respected again, Mr. Trump wrote in a mid-afternoon tweet defending Mr. Tillerson. It marked an operatic turn in Mr. Tillerson's tenure after months of reports that he would soon leave the Trump administration. The latest round was fueled by a plan to force out Mr. Tillerson that was conceived by John F. Kelly, the White House Chief of Staff, and unveiled by senior administration officials on Thursday. The State Department spokeswoman, Heather Nauert, denied on Thursday that Mr. Tillerson was leaving. But the White House Press Secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, notably did not, saying only that there are no personnel announcements at this time when asked whether Mr. Tillerson was on his way out. Mr. Trump had also sidestepped questions on Thursday about Mr. Tillerson's future. He's here. Rex is here, Mr. Trump said then, in an underwhelming display of support that did not challenge the reports of Mr. Tillerson's pending departure. By Friday morning, Mr. Tillerson told reporters at the State Department during a brief appearance with Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj of Libya that the reports were laughable. He then headed to the White House for 2 meetings with Mr. Trump, including a lunch with Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, one of Mr. Tillerson's allies. The president tweeted after those meetings, "Despite his years as a reality TV star who routinely issued the line, 'You're fired,' Mr. Trump has struggled with ousting his staff, even after he has chosen to do so." 2 White House advisers said the president ultimately decided on Friday to bolster Mr. Tillerson with a tweet to avoid undermining his chief diplomat right before he heads overseas to work on a host of global crises. Mr. Tillerson is leaving for Europe on Monday on a week-long trip, when he will attend a NATO meeting in Brussels and then fly to Vienna for a discussion at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe about the years-long unrest in Ukraine. The 2 White House advisers insisted, however, that Mr. Tillerson is expected to leave sometime in January. In the plan revealed on Thursday, Mr. Tillerson would be succeeded by Mike Pompeo, currently the CIA director, who is more closely aligned with Mr. Trump on a series of important foreign policy matters. Mr. Tillerson's refusal to resign despite his disagreements with Mr. Trump, and the president's reported dislike for the diplomat, may have been the reason senior administration officials leaked Mr. Kelly's plan this week to replace him. Mr. Tillerson had previously and repeatedly denied reports of his impending departure, even going so far as to hold a news conference in October to say, "There's never been a consideration in my mind to leave." The debate over Mr. Tillerson's status is the latest outgrowth of a White House that has been beset by internal battles, high-level departures, indictments of 2 top former campaign officials and guilty pleas from a former national security advisor and a campaign advisor. All have contributed to a generalized sense of chaos that shows few signs of abating, even as the administration nears the completion of its first year in power. Mr. Tillerson is a phlegmatic former chief executive of ExxonMobil whose personal net worth is estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. His continued service to a White House that so obviously wants him gone has led to something of a cottage industry of speculation in Washington about his reasons for remaining. One theory, frequently repeated at the State Department, is that an early departure would cost Mr. Tillerson millions of dollars in taxes for assets he sold to take the diplomatic post. Tax experts have dismissed this notion. After being nominated, Mr. Tillerson was granted a so-called certificate of divestiture that allowed him to sell off Exxon stock without having to immediately pay capital gains taxes on those holdings. 2 lawyers involved in issuing these documents said that the federal law creating this process, which is intended to eliminate a disincentive to qualified individuals joining the government, has no provision to withdraw this benefit, assuming that Mr. Tillerson completed the sale of his stocks before he left his government job. The ethics agreement that Mr. Tillerson signed in January, after he was nominated, indicated that he planned to complete the sale of his Exxon stock and other potentially problematic stock assets within 90 days of his confirmation. As long as Mr. Tillerson followed the plan, the timing of his resignation would have no impact on his tax liability, the lawyers said. It is also believed that Mr. Tillerson has become so wedded to a State Department reorganization that he launched earlier this year that he will not leave until it is in place. That is expected to occur early next year. Mr. Tillerson has said the reorganization is his highest priority. He intends to slash the State Department's personnel by 8% and its budget by 31%. The cuts are needed, he has said many times, because many of the world's conflicts will soon be resolved. This view is dismissed as naive both within the State Department and the broader foreign policy community. Mr. Tillerson has made clear he has little use for much of the day-to-day diplomacy conducted by his workforce. Diplomats across the State Department spent much of Thursday and Friday checking the phones for news announcing Mr. Tillerson's departure. His personal press aide, R.C. Hammond, is expected to leave his post this month, according to 3 people in the department with direct knowledge of the situation and who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss personnel issues. Mr. Hammond denied he would be leaving soon. "You're not so lucky," Mr. Hammond wrote in an email. "You still get to work with me." Eric Lipton and Maggie Haberman contributed reporting from Washington. A version of this article appears in print on December 2, 2017, on page A13 of the New York edition with the headline "Defiance from Tillerson, Support from President."